On a spring morning in the year 399 before the Common Era, in the open-air courts of Athens, a jury of 500 ordinary citizens sat down to decide whether the most famous thinker in the city should be put to death. His name was Socrates. He was 70 years old. He had fought for Athens as a soldier. He had spent 40 years in her marketplace asking questions that powerful men could not answer. He had written nothing. He charged no fees. He simply would not stop asking. The charges against him were two: that he did not believe in the gods of the city, and that he corrupted the young men of Athens. There was no judge to guide the jury. There were no rules of evidence. There was only a crowd, a water clock, and a vote. This is the trial of Socrates. To understand the trial, you have to understand that the Athens of 399 was a city that had recently been broken. Just 5 years earlier, in 404, Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, a catastrophe that ended almost a century of Athenian power. The city's long walls had been pulled down to the sound of flute music. Her fleet was gone. Her empire was gone. And then it got worse. Sparta installed a brutal puppet government of 30 oligarchs, remembered ever after as the 30 tyrants. In a few months of terror, the 30 executed perhaps 1,500 citizens and seized their property. When the democracy finally fought its way back into power, Athens was traumatized, suspicious, and looking for someone to blame. And here was Socrates' problem. Two of the most hated figures of that nightmare had been, in their youth, his students. Critias, the cruelest of the 30 tyrants, had been in Socrates' circle. So had Alcibiades, the brilliant, treacherous general who had betrayed Athens to Sparta and back again.
I knew him as a student, there as a teacher. And I will say plainly what the prosecutors only hinted. Men looked at Critias and at Alcibiades, and they said these were the companions of Socrates. They did not ask whether he had taught them virtue and been ignored. They asked only who had been in the room.
There was an amnesty. After the Civil War, Athens had formally agreed that no citizen could be prosecuted for political acts committed under the 30. So Socrates could not legally be charged for the company he had kept, but a man could still be charged for impiety, and the city knew it. In Athens, there was no public prosecutor. Any citizen could bring a criminal charge against any other. The prosecution of Socrates was brought by 3 men, and the front man, the one whose name went on the indictment, was a minor poet named Meletus. But Meletus was not the power behind the case. The real force was the second accuser, Anytus. Anytus was a wealthy tanner, a respected democratic politician, and a man who had helped lead the fight to overthrow the 30 tyrants. He was, in the eyes of Athens, a patriot, and he despised everything Socrates represented.
I have no quarrel with wisdom. I have a quarrel with a man who stands in the marketplace and teaches the sons of good families to question their fathers, to sneer at the assembly, to believe that the many are fools and that only the clever few should rule. We have just buried a city's worth of men who believed exactly that. I will not watch him raise another generation of them.
The charge they wrote was carefully built. Socrates, it said, is guilty of refusing to acknowledge the gods recognized by the state and of introducing new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded was death. The impiety charge had a foundation in something real. Socrates often spoke of a private inner voice. He called it his daimonion, a kind of divine sign that warned him against mistakes. To his accusers, that was the opening they needed. A man with his own private god was a man who did not need the city's gods or the city's authority. The trial was held in one of the open-air people's courts of Athens, the Dicasteria, and it bore almost no resemblance to a courtroom as we would recognize one. There was no judge. There was no presiding legal authority to rule on evidence or instruct anyone on the law. There was instead a jury of 500 citizens. Some accounts say 501. An odd number chosen so that a tie was impossible. These jurors were ordinary Athenian men over the age of 30, chosen by lot. They were the jury, and they were also the judge. They decided the facts, they decided the law, and they decided the sentence. There was no appeal. Their verdict was the verdict of Athens itself. Each side was given a fixed amount of time to speak, measured by a water clock, the clepsydra, a vessel that emptied through a hole at a steady rate. When the water ran out, you stopped. The herald opened the proceedings.
Citizens of Athens, sworn jurors of this court, the graphe is brought by Meletus, son of Meletus, against Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, of the deme of Alopes. The accusers will speak first. Let the water be poured.
The prosecution spoke first. Their speeches do not survive in full. But we know the shape of the attack from how Socrates answered it. They told the jury he was a clever talker who could make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. They told the jury he taught young men to disrespect their elders and the gods. They reminded the jury, without ever naming the amnesty, exactly whose teacher he had been. And then the water clock was reset. And Socrates, 70 years old, stood up on the platform to defend his life in front of 500 of his fellow citizens, many of whom had already made up their minds. What Socrates did next is the reason this trial is still studied 24 centuries later. An Athenian on trial for his life was expected to do certain things. He was expected to flatter the jury. He was expected to weep, to plead, to parade his crying children before the court for pity. Socrates refused to do any of it.
How you, men of Athens, have been affected by my accusers, I cannot tell, but I know that they have said scarcely a word of truth. From me you shall hear the whole truth, not, however, delivered in their manner, in a set oration adorned with words and phrases. I shall use the words and arguments which occur to me at the moment.
Socrates told the jury that his real accusers were not Meletus and Anytus. His real accusers were decades of rumor, a reputation built up over a lifetime that he was a sophist and a meddler. And then he explained where that reputation had come from.
A friend of mine went to the oracle at Delphi and asked the god whether any man was wiser than Socrates. And the priestess answered that there was no man wiser. When I heard this, I said to myself, what can the god mean? For I know that I have no wisdom, small or great.
So Socrates set out to prove the oracle wrong. He went to the politicians, the poets, the skilled craftsmen, everyone in Athens, reputed to be wise. And he questioned them. And he found every time the same thing.
I found that the men most in repute were all but the most foolish, and that others, less esteemed, were really wiser and better. I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. In this one little point, then, I seem to have the advantage of him.
That, Socrates told the jury, was his great crime. He had spent 40 years walking up to the most respected men in Athens and gently, publicly proving that they did not know what they claimed to know. He had humiliated the powerful, and the powerful had not forgiven him. Athenian procedure allowed a defendant to question his accuser directly in open court. And so Socrates did the thing he had done in the marketplace for 40 years. He turned to the young poet, Meletus, and began to ask him questions. Socrates wanted to expose one thing in particular. Meletus had charged him both with believing in no gods at all, with being a complete atheist, and in the very same indictment with introducing new gods. Socrates set out to make the jury see the contradiction.
You say that I am an atheist and do not believe in the gods at all. Tell the court, Meletus, do you mean that I teach men not to believe in some gods or in none?
I mean, in none at all.
That is extraordinary. Why do you say that? Do I not believe even in the sun and moon?
He does not. He says the sun is a stone and the moon is earth.
My dear Meletus, you think you are accusing Anaxagoras. You have so low an opinion of the jury and think them so illiterate that they do not know those are the doctrines of other philosophers and not of me. But tell me, does any man believe in the existence of things divine and yet believe in no gods at all?
And there was the trap of 40 years' practice closing. Socrates had drawn Meletus into admitting that the indictment charged him with believing in spiritual things and with believing in nothing at the same time. One charge canceled the other.
There is no man who does
Then no man can believe in the activities of gods and not in gods. You have contradicted yourself, Meletus, in your own indictment. It is as if you said that a man believes in horsemanship, but not in horses.
On the logic, Socrates won the exchange. Cleanly. He had shown the jury that the man who wrote the charge could not even hold the charge together. But Socrates understood something that should have frightened him and did not. He understood that this jury had not come to be persuaded by logic.
I am very far from making a defense for my own sake, as you might imagine. I am making it for yours, so that you may not sin against the God by condemning me, who am his gift to you. If you kill me, you will not easily find another like me. I am a kind of gadfly, given to the state by the god, and the state is a great and noble horse, who is slow in his motions and requires to be stirred into life.
When the speeches were done, the 500 jurors voted. Each man was given 2 small bronze discs, one for conviction, one for acquittal. He placed one in an urn to be counted and discarded the other. There was no deliberation, no discussion. 500 private decisions dropped into a jar. The verdict was guilty. But the margin is one of the most telling details of the entire trial. Out of 500 jurors, the vote to convict is reported as 280 to 220, 60 votes. If just 30 jurors had changed their minds, Socrates would have walked free. He had stood before a hostile city, refused to flatter it, insulted its sense of its own wisdom, and still nearly half the room had voted to let him live. Now came the strangest part of Athenian justice. The law did not set a fixed penalty for this crime. Instead, the prosecution proposed one punishment, the defendant proposed another, and the jury chose between the two. Only the two. There was no third option. The prosecution proposed death. Everyone in the court now waited for Socrates to propose the obvious counteroffer: a heavy fine or voluntary exile, a sentence the jury could accept as a compromise. It was understood. It was expected. It was his life. And Socrates stood up and told the jury that since he had spent his life doing Athens the great service of making her examine herself, what he truly deserved was not a punishment at all.
What shall be done to a man who has never had the wit to be idle, but who has been careless of what most men care for: wealth and family interests and military offices? What would be a reward for such a one? There can be no reward so fitting as to be maintained at the public expense in the great hall, in honor, men of Athens, which he deserves far more than the victor in the Olympic chariot race.
Read that again. Convicted, facing execution, asked to name his own punishment. Socrates suggested that Athens ought to feed him free dinners for life as a civic hero. The court erupted. His friends in the court were horrified. They rushed forward and begged him to propose a real fine. His followers, including a young man named Plato, who would never forget this day, offered to pay it themselves, guaranteeing a sum 30 times larger. Socrates grudgingly allowed that figure to be named. But the offer came too late, and in too sour a spirit to undo what the jury had just heard. The jury voted a second time, now choosing only between death and the fine. This vote was not close. The jury sentenced Socrates to death, and by a wider margin than the margin that had convicted him. Ancient sources note the grim irony. More jurors voted to kill him than had voted to find him guilty in the first place. His own speech, proposing free dinners, had cost him votes from people who had thought him innocent. Given the chance to make a final statement, Socrates did not rage and did not despair. He spoke, by every account, with the same dry calm he had carried all day.
Let us reflect in another way, and we shall see that there is great reason to hope that death is a good. For the state of death is one of two things. Either it is annihilation, and the dead have no consciousness of anything, or it is a change, a migration of the soul from this world to another. And in either case, death is a gain. The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die, and you to live. Which is better? God only knows.
Athenian law usually carried out a death sentence within a day. But Socrates' execution was delayed by nearly a month. A sacred ship had sailed on an annual religious mission, and by ancient custom, no execution could be performed in Athens until that ship returned. So Socrates spent his last weeks in prison. And there, his oldest friend, Crito, came to him before dawn with a plan.
Socrates, I beg you, take my advice and escape. The guards are bribed. We have friends in Thessaly who will keep you safe. Money is no object. If you stay, you give your enemies exactly what they want. You abandon your sons, and men will say that we, your friends, were too cowardly and too cheap to save you.
And Socrates refused. Not from despair. He refused on principle. He had lived his whole life under the laws of Athens, he told Crito. He had accepted their protection, their marriages, their citizenship. To break those laws now, simply because they had finally been turned against him, would make a lie of everything he had ever taught.
We must do no wrong. One must not even do wrong when one is wronged, which most people regard as the natural course. If we leave this place without the permission of the state, are we not doing harm to the very ones we ought least to harm? And are we not breaking the agreements and commitments we ourselves made? I would rather die having spoken in my manner than speak in your manner and live.
When the sacred ship returned, the sentence was carried out. Socrates was given a cup of crushed hemlock. His friends gathered in the cell. By their accounts, it was the friends who wept. and Socrates who comforted them. Socrates died in 399 before the Common Era. He left no writings. Everything we know of him comes from others. Above all, from the young follower who watched the trial and never recovered from it, Plato. Plato would go on to found a school, the Academy, and to write the dialogues that preserve Socrates' voice, including the Apology, the account of this trial. Plato's most famous student was Aristotle. Aristotle's most famous student was Alexander the Great. An entire river of Western thought runs out of the questions of a man Athens voted to kill. As for Athens, the city did not feel triumphant for long. Ancient writers report that within a few years, Athenians came to regret the verdict. One late tradition holds that the city turned on the accusers themselves, that Meletus was put to death, and that Anytus was driven into exile. The details are uncertain. The shame is not. The trial of Socrates became almost immediately the permanent example of a danger that no constitution has ever fully solved. A free people, frightened and humiliated, using a fair-looking court and an honest vote to silence the one voice it could not answer. The trial of Socrates is not really a story about one stubborn old man. It is a story about a court that worked exactly as designed. 500 citizens, an equal hearing, a clean vote, no corruption, and that still produced a verdict the city would spend centuries trying to live down. A fair procedure, Socrates reminds us, is not the same thing as a just result. If you want to come with us to other courtrooms, to the trial of Joan of Arc, to the dock at Nuremberg, to the day a nation put its own king on trial for his life, subscribe to the highest court, because the oldest and hardest lesson of the law is this: a vote can be counted perfectly and still be wrong.